My brother spent 11 years presenting my company as if it belonged entirely to him. He appeared on magazine covers, attended private investor events, and gave interviews about the vision that supposedly built StriveX Logistics from nothing. Meanwhile, I sat behind conference room doors answering emails under the title of Operations Assistant, pretending not to notice that my own work carried someone else's name. Then one morning, I entered his executive board meeting holding a folder filled with documents he believed disappeared years ago, and within less than an hour, the version of reality he created started breaking apart in front of the people who once admired him. Before I continue, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe if you enjoy emotional business betrayal stories like this one. My name is Kaya Mercer, and the truth is, my brother Nolan didn't steal my company all at once. He did it gradually, step by step, until even I began questioning whether my role ever mattered. 11 years earlier, we were struggling siblings sharing a small apartment in Portland. I worked exhausting overnight shifts at a warehouse while secretly building a logistics software system during every free hour I had. Nolan knew almost nothing about coding, shipping systems, or operational design, but he had a natural ability to impress people. He could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with everyone believing in him within minutes. At the beginning, I truly thought we were building something together. I handled the technical side, while Nolan handled presentations and networking. That balance seemed fair to me at the time. I stayed focused on development while he searched for investors willing to take a chance on us. Then money entered the picture, and everything slowly changed. Potential investors started asking questions about leadership, image, and public confidence. Somehow those conversations always ended with Nolan positioned as the real founder, while I remained invisible in the background. Every time I questioned it, he reassured me the arrangement was temporary. He told me success required appearances. He promised that once the company became stable, everyone would finally learn the truth about who created the system that made StriveX successful. I wanted to believe him because he was my brother. Looking back now, trusting him was the first decision that cost me everything. StriveX Logistics grew faster than either of us imagined. What started as a small software idea inside a cramped apartment quickly turned into a company managing retail distribution contracts across several states. Within only a few years, executives who once ignored us were suddenly asking for meetings. Investors wanted partnerships, and industry publications started calling Nolan a rising entrepreneur. The success changed him almost immediately. He became consumed with image. Expensive tailored suits replaced the hoodies he used to wear while sleeping on our apartment couch. He joined exclusive business clubs, attended networking events every weekend, and memorized the kind of confident language investors loved hearing. The more attention he received, the more he enjoyed standing at the center of it. While Nolan built his public identity, I stayed buried inside the actual work keeping the company alive. Whenever clients experienced system failures, I fixed them before sunrise. When major shipping contracts were close to collapsing, I negotiated solutions quietly through late-night calls and emergency revisions. If frustrated employees threatened to leave because Nolan dismissed their concerns, I convinced them to stay long enough for projects to survive. I handled pressure from every direction while watching someone else receive praise for the results. Still, none of that appeared publicly. At conferences and meetings, Nolan introduced me as his operations assistant. Sometimes he called me part of the support team, as if I were simply helping organize schedules instead of running the systems behind the company's success. I accepted it longer than I should have because he kept repeating the same promise. Once the business became stable, he would finally tell everyone the truth. Instead, the lies became bigger. During interviews, he started describing moments that never happened. He told reporters stories about staying awake all night, building the company's first software model, repeating ideas copied directly from notebooks I wrote years earlier. He even framed sketches from my original planning documents inside his office as decorative reminders of his early vision. Visitors admired them constantly without realizing whose handwriting covered every page. The hardest part was not hearing him lie. It was watching people believe every word. Over time, employees stopped seeing me as someone important. New executives assumed I was emotionally dependent on Nolan because we were family, not because I built the infrastructure they relied on daily. The longer I stayed silent, the more permanent his version of history became. Eventually, I started feeling invisible inside the company I created with my own hands. My parents made the situation far more painful than it ever needed to be. Growing up, Nolan was always treated like someone extraordinary. He was confident, athletic, loud, and naturally comfortable around attention. Teachers loved him, neighbors admired him, and relatives constantly talked about how successful he would become one day. I was the opposite, quiet, reserved, more interested in solving problems than impressing people. Social situations exhausted me, and I usually stayed in the background while Nolan controlled every conversation around him. That difference followed us into adulthood. When Strivex became successful, my parents acted as though Nolan had single-handedly built the entire company from nothing. My mother loved introducing him as a visionary businessman. She framed magazine articles about him around her house and proudly repeated every interview quote to family friends. Whenever people asked about me, the conversation always shifted into something smaller. Kaya helps him with the technical side, my mother would say casually. Helping him. Every time I heard those words, something inside me tightened. I created the software that launched the company. I designed the operational systems, solved the distribution failures, and carried the business through problems Nolan didn't even understand. Yet somehow my role became reduced to helping. At first, I tried correcting people politely, but after years of hearing the same version repeated by everyone around me, I slowly stopped defending myself. The false narrative became so constant that even I began shrinking into the smaller role they assigned me. It felt easier to stay silent than to constantly explain the truth to people already determined not to believe it. Then Nolan married Celeste. She was elegant, socially polished, and extremely observant. Within weeks of joining the family, she understood exactly how insecure Nolan really was beneath the confidence. She realized his entire identity depended on people seeing him as the genius behind Strivex. Instead of challenging that lie, she encouraged it because their lifestyle depended on maintaining the illusion. Luxury vacations, massive homes, charity galas, private parties, all of it revolved around Nolan being viewed as the successful founder. One evening during a family dinner, the conversation turned toward the company's anniversary celebration. Celeste laughed while sipping wine and casually said, "Kaya's basically the company mascot at this point." The table burst into laughter. Even Nolan smiled. That moment changed something inside me permanently. Not because the comment was cruel, but because I finally understood the truth. My brother had no intention of ever acknowledging what I built. My invisibility wasn't accidental anymore. It was necessary for the life he wanted to keep living. What most people never understood was that nearly every important contract keeping Strivex alive existed because of me. Nolan was excellent at attracting attention in the beginning. He knew how to charm investors, dominate conversations, and create the image of a confident executive with unlimited ambition. People enjoyed meeting him because he made success sound exciting and effortless. But confidence only carried him so far. Once clients moved past introductions and started asking difficult questions about logistics, fulfillment systems, operational failures, and distribution strategy, Nolan struggled. He could sell a dream, but he couldn't maintain trust when companies needed real solutions. That responsibility always landed on me. Quietly, without recognition, I became the person major clients depended on behind closed doors. I handled emergency calls in the middle of the night when shipping systems crashed unexpectedly. I stepped into meetings after accounts were already falling apart and rebuilt relationships before contracts disappeared entirely. Some weeks I barely slept because I was rewriting broken distribution plans overnight just to prevent millions in losses. While Nolan attended networking events and interviews, I stayed buried inside spreadsheets, software updates, and crisis management. Most executives assumed Nolan was fixing everything personally because he made sure they never saw my involvement clearly. He forwarded my emails from his own account to make it appear as though the ideas came directly from him. He entered meetings after I had already solved the problem and presented finalized strategies as his own work. At one point, he even instructed assistants not to include me on executive correspondence unless absolutely necessary. Important conversations happened around me, while I quietly carried the pressure of keeping the company functional. Still, I stayed. Part of me genuinely loved the company because I remembered building it from nothing. Every system, every process, every successful expansion carried pieces of my effort inside it. Another part of me feared that exposing Nolan publicly would destroy everything we spent years creating together. I convinced myself that protecting the business mattered more than protecting my own identity. Then Victor Hale entered our lives. Victor owned one of the largest retail supply chains in the country, and securing his partnership transformed Strivex overnight. The deal brought national credibility, enormous revenue, and access to opportunities we never imagined possible. Nolan spent years bragging about how he personally convinced Victor to trust the company. That story was fiction. After their first meeting, Victor privately told me he never wanted to negotiate with Nolan again. He found him performative, careless, and unreliable. From that point forward, every major discussion happened directly through me. Contract revisions, crisis negotiations, long-term strategy sessions, all of it stayed between Victor and me, while Nolan continued taking public credit for success he never earned. Everything finally changed during Strivex's 11th anniversary gala. The event was held inside a luxury downtown hotel filled with investors, executives, reporters, and longtime clients celebrating the company's success. Giant screens displayed photos of Nolan shaking hands with business leaders, while employees applauded from round banquet tables covered in gold decorations. The entire night revolved around reinforcing the image he spent years creating. I stayed near the back of the ballroom, exactly where people expected me to be. Nolan stood on stage delivering another polished speech about sacrifice, leadership, and perseverance. He spoke confidently about building Strivex from nothing, carefully shaping every detail into a story that made him sound visionary and self-made. The audience loved it. They laughed at his jokes, applauded his milestones, and nodded along as if they were listening to someone inspirational. Then his attention shifted toward me. At first, I assumed he was about to acknowledge my contributions for once. Instead, he smiled into the microphone and said, "People always assume Kaya helped build this company because she's my sister. Honestly, she'd probably still be fixing office printers somewhere if I hadn't brought her into Strivex." The ballroom erupted with laughter. For a second, I could barely process what I heard. My body felt completely still while the sound echoed around the room. Strangers laughed because they believed it was harmless humor. Executives laughed because they wanted Nolan's approval. Some employees looked uncomfortable but stayed silent anyway. What shattered me was not the humiliation itself. It was the expression on Nolan's face afterward. I saw relief. Relief that the room accepted his version of reality without hesitation. Relief that even after 11 years, nobody questioned the lie. In that moment, I finally understood something painful. My brother was not protecting the company or preserving appearances anymore. He genuinely needed people to see me as insignificant because his entire identity depended on it. I left the gala early without speaking to anyone. That night, I returned home and opened a storage box hidden in the back of my closet, something I had avoided touching for years. Inside were documents from the earliest days of Strivex, original incorporation filings, early software designs covered in my handwriting, contracts connected to the system I created, archived emails discussing development decisions, even private messages from Nolan admitting the company would not exist without me. I sat on the floor for hours reading everything carefully. For years, I convinced myself I stayed silent to protect the business, but staring at those documents forced me to confront the truth. I had spent more than a decade protecting the person who slowly erased me from my own life. What Nolan never realized was that years earlier, during the chaotic beginning of Strivex, he made a mistake that quietly changed everything. Before investors entered the picture, before the company had offices or publicity, we were just two struggling siblings trying to keep a startup alive. Back then, Nolan's financial history created problems. His credit score was terrible, and several legal advisors warned that certain agreements would move faster if key protections were temporarily filed under my name instead. Nolan signed the documents without paying much attention. At the time, he treated paperwork like an inconvenience standing between him and success. He assumed the filings were temporary technicalities that would eventually disappear once the company grew larger. I remember him joking about how lawyers loved making simple things look complicated, but those documents never disappeared. As the years passed, Strivex evolved through new investments, restructuring agreements, and ownership adjustments. Shares shifted between investors, executives came and went, and the company expanded into something far bigger than either of us expected. Yet buried beneath all those changes was one original ownership clause, directly connected to the earliest filings. The filings connected to me. At first, I could barely believe it myself. After the gala incident, I secretly gathered every document I could find and scheduled a meeting with an attorney named Grant Ellis, someone experienced in corporate ownership disputes. I expected him to tell me there was nothing meaningful left in the paperwork. I assumed too much time had passed and too many changes had happened for any of it to matter legally anymore. Instead, Grant spent hours reviewing contracts, amendments, investor agreements, and incorporation records with growing seriousness. The longer he read, the quieter he became. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and removed his glasses slowly. I still remember the expression on his face because it looked less like surprise and more like concern. "Kaya," he said carefully, "your brother may be the public face of Strivex, but legally, you still control the company." Hearing those words made me feel physically ill. I didn't feel victorious or empowered. I felt sick to my stomach because I suddenly understood how fragile Nolan's entire world actually was. The mansions, interviews, executive reputation, investor relationships, all of it rested on a foundation he never fully understood. For 11 years, I believed he stole my identity emotionally. Now I realize something far worse. He built his entire life around a version of reality that could collapse the moment the truth surfaced publicly. I sat in silence for several minutes after Grant finished explaining everything. Part of me still wanted to protect Nolan despite everything he had done. But another part of me finally understood that protecting him meant continuing to erase myself. And for the first time in over a decade, I stopped feeling guilty about fighting back. 3 weeks after my meeting with Grant Ellis, Strivex entered full panic mode. Rumors started spreading through executive circles that Victor Hale was preparing to end his partnership with the company. Investors were nervous, senior managers were demanding answers, and Nolan suddenly scheduled an emergency board meeting to calm everyone before the situation spiraled further out of control. What nobody in that building understood was that the rumors were completely true. Victor was exhausted from pretending Nolan mattered more than the people actually keeping the company functional. For years he tolerated the performance because the business relationship remained profitable, but eventually even he reached his limit. The morning of the meeting, I arrived at headquarters wearing a simple black suit and carrying a folder filled with documents I had spent days organizing carefully. The second I stepped onto the executive floor, conversations around me became awkwardly quiet. Some employees looked confused to see me there. Others avoided eye contact entirely, as if my presence alone created tension they did not want attached to them. By then, most executives no longer viewed me as someone important. I had spent too many years hidden in the background, while Nolan stood publicly at the center of everything. The moment Nolan saw me entering the boardroom, anger flashed across his face immediately. "What are you doing here?" he asked sharply. "I'm attending the meeting," I answered calmly. His expression hardened. "You don't work in executive operations." Before I could respond, Celeste leaned back in her chair with a smug smile and whispered loudly enough for the entire table to hear, "She really can't let go of the company, can she?" A few people laughed quietly. For one painful second I considered walking out. My chest felt tight, and I could already feel the familiar pressure of humiliation building inside me again. But then memories started flooding back all at once. Every overnight crisis call, every contract I saved, every employee I protected. Every moment Nolan erased my contribution while accepting praise meant for someone else. So instead of leaving, I walked to the far end of the table and sat down silently. The meeting started immediately afterward. Nolan launched into a rehearsed presentation about market instability, declining profit margins, and operational concerns affecting the company. At first, he spoke carefully, trying to sound composed and strategic in front of the board. Then the conversation shifted toward accountability. Within minutes, Nolan began blaming internal inefficiencies for recent instability. Everyone in the room understood exactly who he meant. He criticized operational management indirectly before eventually calling me emotionally unstable in front of executives who had worked beside me for years. That was the exact moment the boardroom doors opened. Every conversation stopped instantly. Victor Hale walked inside, and the atmosphere in the room changed so fast it almost felt physical. The second Victor Hale entered the boardroom, every executive around the table stood up automatically. His presence carried the kind of authority that instantly shifted the atmosphere inside the room. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, laptops closed, and even Nolan's aggressive tone disappeared almost immediately. For years, Victor had been one of the most valuable partners connected to Strivex, and everyone understood how much the company depended on maintaining that relationship. Nolan changed his expression so quickly it almost looked rehearsed. His anger vanished behind a polished smile as he stepped forward confidently. "Victor, glad you made it," he said smoothly, extending his hand. Victor ignored him completely. Instead, he walked past Nolan and looked directly at me. "Kaya," he said calmly, "it's good to see you again." The room fell silent so fast it became uncomfortable. I could feel executives staring between us, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Nolan let out a nervous laugh, clearly attempting to regain control of the moment. "You two already know each other?" he asked, forcing a smile that no longer looked convincing. Victor stared at him with visible disbelief. "She negotiated every contract we've ever signed with Strivex," he replied without hesitation. I watched confusion spread across the faces surrounding the table. Some executives exchanged glances, while others looked down at documents as though trying to connect pieces of information they suddenly realized never made sense before. Victor remained completely calm, while Nolan's composure slowly started breaking apart. For 11 years, Victor continued, your sister handled every major operational crisis tied to our accounts. She solved problems your leadership team couldn't fix. Frankly, Nolan, most of us assumed everyone here already understood who was actually running this company behind the scenes. The color drained from Nolan's face. For the first time in years, he looked genuinely afraid. Then Victor placed a thick folder on the conference table. The sound echoed sharply through the silent room. Inside were years of communication records, revised contract agreements, operational strategies, negotiation histories, and emergency planning documents tied directly to me. Every page showed my involvement clearly. My name appeared everywhere. Nolan claimed it never belonged. Not his, mine. Executives started flipping through the material rapidly, while legal advisors whispered to each other in low voices. One board member looked physically stunned reading through the records. Another stared directly at Nolan as if seeing him differently for the first time. Nolan tried interrupting, but Victor cut him off immediately. Then came the sentence that changed everything. My company will not renew a single contract with Strivex unless Kaya Mercer becomes CEO effective immediately. The room froze. In one moment, the entire image Nolan spent 11 years building began collapsing in front of the people he worked hardest to impress. The boardroom descended into chaos almost instantly after Victor finished speaking. Executives grabbed folders from the table and started scanning documents with growing panic, while attorneys whispered urgently to one another near the windows. Questions started flying from every direction at once. One investor demanded immediate clarification about ownership structures, while another asked why critical operational leadership had apparently been hidden from the board for years. Nolan completely unraveled under the pressure. The confident executive persona he spent over a decade building disappeared within minutes. His voice became louder, sharper, and increasingly desperate as he tried to regain control of the room. First, he accused me of betrayal. Then he claimed I was jealous of his success and trying to destroy the company out of resentment. At one point, he even insisted Victor had been emotionally manipulated into turning against him. Nobody interrupted him, but nobody defended him either. That silence said more than any argument could have. Then the boardroom doors opened again. Grant Ellis walked inside carrying another stack of legal documents, and the atmosphere shifted immediately. He calmly introduced himself as corporate counsel representing ownership interests connected to the original Strivex filings. Several executives looked confused at first, but the moment Grant began explaining the documentation, expressions around the table changed rapidly. He outlined how the earliest company protections had been filed under my name years earlier due to Nolan's financial issues at the time. He explained how later restructuring agreements never fully removed the controlling clauses tied to those original filings. Every amendment, investor revision, and legal adjustment still connected back to the foundation established during the company's earliest stage. Meaning legally, I still held controlling ownership rights. The room became so quiet I could hear someone breathing near the far side of the table. Nolan stared at Grant like he was speaking another language. This can't be real, he kept repeating, again and again. But the documents were real. The signatures were real. The legal chain connecting everything together was undeniable. Years of carefully constructed lies started collapsing in public view directly in front of the executives, investors, and advisors. Nolan spent his entire career trying to impress. Across the table, Celeste looked horrified, not emotionally devastated, terrified. I could see the realization spreading across her face as the truth settled in. Without Strivex, the luxury lifestyle disappeared too. The homes, private events, vacations, and social status all depended on Nolan remaining untouchable. And suddenly he wasn't untouchable anymore. The board called for an emergency vote later that afternoon. Leadership suspended Nolan immediately pending further investigation. Security escorted him off the executive floor, while employees watched silently through the glass office walls lining the hallway. Some looked uncomfortable. Others avoided eye contact completely. What surprised me most was the absence of shock. Nobody seemed truly stunned, only disappointed. As if somewhere deep down, people had sensed for years that the story they were told never completely matched reality. After Nolan was removed from leadership, I stayed alone inside the CEO office for almost an hour without moving. The building had finally become quiet after an entire day of arguments, emergency meetings, legal discussions, and shocked conversations spreading through every department. I sat near the window staring at the city skyline, while the weight of everything slowly settled over me. It was strange being inside that office again. I recognized every detail because years earlier, I helped design the space myself. I chose the layout, approved the operational systems, and planned the structure of the executive floor long before Nolan turned it into a monument dedicated to himself. For more than a decade, I walked through those halls pretending my presence did not matter while watching someone else claim ownership over the life I built. I thought exposing the truth would feel triumphant. Instead, it felt quiet, not satisfying, not glamorous, just heavy, like finally putting down something painful I carried for too many years without realizing how exhausted it made me. Over the next week, Nolan called constantly. At first, his messages were furious. He accused me of humiliating him publicly and destroying the company's reputation. Then the anger faded into desperation. He started talking about family, loyalty, and everything we survived together growing up. He wanted sympathy now that the illusion protecting him was gone. Eventually, he left one voicemail I listened to several times. "You could have handled this privately." Hearing that almost made me laugh. I tried handling it privately for 11 years. I stayed silent during interviews. I tolerated humiliation at family dinners. I accepted smaller titles, smaller recognition, and smaller spaces inside a company I created because I hoped Nolan would eventually do the right thing on his own. The truth only exploded publicly because his arrogance kept pushing things further until there was no quiet solution left. Once leadership changed, rebuilding StriveX became my main focus. I rehired talented employees, Nolan forced out for challenging him. I repaired strained relationships with clients who had grown frustrated by executive dishonesty. Slowly, the culture inside the company started changing into something healthier and more honest than it had been in years. My family reacted differently. Some apologized awkwardly after realizing how much damage their favoritism caused. Others avoided responsibility completely because admitting the truth meant confronting their own behavior too. Surprisingly, none of it affected me the way it once would have. For the first time in my life, I stopped needing their approval to feel valuable. That experience taught me something important. When people silence you long enough, eventually you start confusing silence with identity. You begin believing your role is to stay small so others can stay comfortable. But silence is not personality. Sometimes strength is simply walking back into the room where people tried to erase you and refusing to disappear anymore.